Hello everyone, today we talk about Constantine I and his times, his era. It seems strange that after 800 videos we never dedicated one to Constantine himself. We talked a bit about, of course, the end of the tetrarchy, the establishment of the so-called Constantinian system. We talked about the Constantinian Senate. In one video, a person asked me, you mean Constantinople? No, I mean Constantinian, because we have didactic scansions for senatorial history as well, that, from a political and institutional point of view, Constantine definitely started its own way. First of all, founding it, but also giving it a specific character. So today we will partially readdress some of these aspects, but also broadening the picture at the wall and try to talk a bit, not much about the figure himself, because this video is not about, it's not a biography, it's not about Constantine as a person, about whom we also know a very few in terms of actual historical reality. Surely, it turns out Constantine, that people tend to be very opinionated on Constantine. It's usually either a love or hate question, where he was either the good guy or the evil guy. There are naturally lots of ideological reasons from both standpoints in a way. As you know, I don't, and I presume also you don't like such approach, and we have explained for many reasons. By this point in Roman history, we have, not that before it was easy, right, but surely at this point things worsen in terms of getting a critical historiographical information that is either pro or against these figures. Naturally, Constantine as Roman emperor and as basically reuniter of the empire, of let's say favorer of the Christianity, but also in here with a lot to say the least ambiguities, has been interpreted as this broader, this enormous figure. Right? Constantine is known also as the Great, and we are surely talking about the giants of Western civilization. This has not the slightest to do with whatever your personal sympathy or antipathy towards him is about. His times are probably one of the single most studied, historiographically speaking. Also, in fact, at some point to me, not with this huge profit. I've personally never entered in the specific matters of this historiographical moment, but it seems to me that we live more still of the ideology of the whole meaning of Constantine, and as the starter of eventually, and improperly it's called the Byzantine reality, if you want, from one side the sanctioning of a specific political and social order that was taking also specific religious directions independently, even here from specifically Christianity or paganism, but properly the relation of religion with power, and it's obviously one of those themes we really want to discuss more historiographically than actually historically, because historically at a certain point you simply come to exhaust a bit certain questions. Why? Also, because Constantine definitely, as many other emperors, is, as we were saying before, a mysterious figure. It's not that we know properly what he concretely did at certain levels. Well, mostly we give this in didactic, separation, for which Diocletian allegedly, reformed the administration and the tax system, while Constantine the army and the monastery system. And generally speaking, we tend to give them this to this specific, to these relative figures, this specific cut. It's today, at least historiography I think has clarified that it's probably part of a much more complex transformation that surely was catalyzed in Diocletian and possibly and truly, yes, in Constantinian times. Definitely Constantine took some paths, certain directions that Diocletian had not yet tried. Diocletian is somewhat seen still as the the anachronistic attempt to restore the previous system of the silver currency of the middle classes of this precarious political institutional balance that didn't hold. The tetrarchy didn't hold. And Constantine, as instead the great innovator that set this trend, that eventually would have developed and would have given this extreme sound basis, especially to the eastern half of the Roman Empire, to continue in its millenary journey, also after the fall of the western half. I agree, generally speaking. I don't find many, at this point, at least of my understanding of these topics, I don't find much to disagree with that. Always stressing, however, that we know a very few about what these people individually did. What do we know actually about the government? Who did what, right? Who came up with the ideas? What was already set by society, which is actually a lot, starting from the Edict of Milan that was actually just being already issued in the East, and that was repeated almost at the same level textually in the West, that, as you know, granted the freedom of cult to Christianity. We don't know also about the army, right? The army might have simply arrived at that point by itself. We can't say specifically Constantine, right, did the whole thing. Of course, he probably formalized and regularized most of this system. And as you know, I'm a great fan, let's say, poorly phrasing the definition, as of Constantinian army. That is one of the single most overlooked military systems, I think, in the history of mankind. There are still generally the prejudices about those, there are those people that love whatever happened in the East, so they have to say it was like the best thing ever. There are those that hate whatever happened in the East, so they have to say, this is the beginning of the end, the decline. Yes, an empire that declined for more than 1,000 years. Well, that's not a decline. That's not the definition of decline. And definitely, the 4th century Roman Empire was a pretty damn impressive thing, right? We can hardly see a crisis up to fundamentally just Adrianople, which also by itself was not even this great changer as a specific political military event. That was not the problem. But from there, a lot of problems start happening as a consequence in a chain. It could have been prevented, but generally speaking, we said mostly up to the 80s, up to Theodosian times, the empire that Constantine had set remained more or less in the essentials, and eventually began a change that naturally in the East saw also the consolidation of the Constantinian system, but also started becoming something different. So these are all interpretations that we could stay here to discuss forever, right? And that I also think are important, albeit being important to be presented at a certain point, should also be substantiated with a more analytical approach. So today we talk, generally speaking, of Constantine's era, right, and what was accomplished broadly meant. What are the main, the hot topics of this reality. And in the future, naturally, we will keep talking about Constantine, saying Constantinian era, Constantinian army, that we haven't also properly discussed in detail. But there are a couple of videos that I made that embrace late antiquity, late Roman army in general. So we could start from the crisis of the tetrarchic system that had been created by Diocletian with this, fairly simple conceptually speaking, but kind of machinous, in fact, dynamic of the split of the empire in 4 halves. And let's say better of 2 halves commanded by the Augusti, and eventually that controlled, however, respectively, just one half of the half, but namely were the most important, and the other fourth was controlled by the Caesars, So the other half split in two, and then the Caesars would have succeeded to the Augusti, and they would have appointed another other Caesars, and going on, pretending that that would have been a functional thing. Objectively, I think we made a video on the tetrarchic system, and we highlighted the dysfunctionality and ultimately the failure of this thing, and that's, in my opinion, actually what really makes some of the greatest differences in from Diocletian to Constantine at many levels. Probably the single most important thing. I mean, the realization that, of course, the control of the empire had to be unique, or at least even if there were further splits afterwards, that this unity was to, however, always be preferred, and that even if at some point Theodosius decides, after having reunited the empire, after the struggles that anyhow happened in the meanwhile, so all these chunks sometimes going their own way with rebellions, usurpers, and so on, the division had to somewhat exist on some important basis that objectively did exist in terms of difference between the East and the West. It's also a big topic that we have addressed elsewhere. But in Constantinian times, objectively, the unity was reacquired, and this unity naturally required also a specific political and institutional system that could hold the thing together. And the fact that this took a monarchic direction compared to previous times, it is a trend that we see increasing since Augustus onwards. I mean, the Roman Empire was, since Augustus, de facto a monarchy, right? The Republic was namely a republic, but it was naturally fictional. It was Rome had always been an oligarchy. That becomes a monarchy, mitigated one at some levels, or at least a negotiated one. Eventually, as you know, the increasing crisis and social stratification, hierarchization, etc., brings naturally to this. And the East, the eastern half of the empire, will increase these characters also because of pre-existing political institutional cultures that in the East since millennia had fundamentally accepted the existence of an absolute monarch, fundamentally, very differently from the West. And this is also another topic that somebody doesn't like, because they want to say, oh no, we were not like the East. We don't, certain parts of Europe, we don't. Well, technically there was, right? It's no surprise that, of course, the Roman Empire did massively influence, for example, the Persian monarchy, which is often overlooked, but also, Persian models, specifically Eastern models, were also imported over time. This is a macroscopical historiographical topic. There's plenty of publications on this, how even what would be called the Byzantine court ritual, etc., was deeply influenced by the Sassanids, by other even other philosophies, other mindsets compared to what would happen in the West. It had this reinjection of Germanic, let's say, egalitarianism, at least at an oligarchic level. But it's an important topic that doesn't begin with these points, because just look at how Augustus back in the day presented himself to the Romans. It was basically a citizen like all the others, and how presented himself, I don't know, to the Egyptians, that is to say, the new pharaoh of the situation. This is also pretty well known. So certain differences were very important and cannot be ignored. Also, when you think that Constantinople was, yes, compared to places like Syria or Egypt, a different world, but that nevertheless was now from a certain point onwards stuck to with those provinces. It required even just a sclerotization of the political and institutional structures, and yes, there is a contraction of that capacity of of that flexibility that had been a prerogative of the empire. This doesn't mean that the empire was dysfunctional. On the contrary, right? But we cannot deny that there was an autocratization of power. That is, to say the least, was not a monarchization, if not an absolutization. This is evident also in the relations with the church. that will be at the base. Also, the main differences today is, the Catholics and Orthodox and so on. But this begins in this harbor, this eastern harbor, we could say. The crisis of the tetrarchic system was already evident since 307 AD, when two Augusti contended the throne, and this, so, a pretty good proof of the fact that they didn't want just, they weren't content just over the half of the empire, and this brought to a long series of civil wars, right? These are all things we will look at in detail. We have actually already discussed in other videos, so here I will be concise. That terminated in 324 with Constantine's victory as a sole ruler, right? He had began, he ruled between 324 and 337. He had been proclaimed Caesar in the west in 306 as heir to his father's Constantius Chlorus, and in 312 he won his rival Maxentius at the famous battle of the Milvian Bridge. The mythology of that, Maxentius is a very fascinating figure, and even in there, we kind of stereotyped the two figures and the two political trends, and objectively, even here, I presume actually Constantine was the one that saw more far, but he could have simply lost even in that condition, and the history might have gone in a radically different way. The Constantinian campaigns in Gaul, in Italy, are very famous, right? He was basically he started actually with a very small army compared to these enemies, but he was very aggressive, very straightforward, very decided, and we can't see, the essence of the man in these events. In the February of 313, as we were saying before, in Milan, he promulgated the famous Edict of Tolerance towards the Christian cult that opened the Christians and basically the higher posts in society, because now they weren't discriminated anymore, and this brings to an enormous also cultural enrichment and education of the Christian elites that begin to enter properly as peers in the debate with paganism, that begin at this point, we can say maybe this is the other great topic, could Christianity be stemmed at that point as well, the thing with Julian and so on. This is also another topic, we don't discuss it here. In my opinion, it's not that it couldn't be stopped, but at which cost, right? For the unity of the empire in itself, it would have been a mess, right? So, but in 324, coming back to Constantine, he defeated in the east the last of his rivals, Licinius, that had opposed him as the last contendent, so that Constantine, after his victory, became unique emperor of the whole Roman Empire. So immediately after, he thought of the construction of this new capital. It was chosen in the ancient city of Byzantium in Latin, that was transformed and widened to serve to this specific role, and that was solemnly inaugurated on May 11th, 330. Constantine had built in the city many churches, but also profane buildings, among which an imperial palace, and he provided the city with a new city ring. And this step is very important to discuss, because there is a current of thought, let's say, with roots in the ancient Christian tradition that spotted in the foundation of Constantinople the positive intention to provide the empire with a new capital that could antagonize with pagan Rome, right? This is one of those topics that would deserve like a video on their own, because even if you think about Maxentius and what his goals really were. He actually was tolerant towards the Christians, but he also was, for the coexistence with paganism, he had also different idea where the center of the empire really was. So that offers, for example, a valid mean of comparison. But even in here, the differences are not really huge. The foundation of Constantinople, in reality, was not probably enacted as a revolutionary act, right? Every time you see something in the history is attached to this idea of revolution, you can be concretely certain that it's not worth nothing, right? Historical conspirate, as long as, of course, you speak of, I don't know, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or this stuff. Yeah, no, we got used to call them that way, but it's named like another. It could be, I don't know, the French apple. We would refer to the same thing. But probably, as you know, the concept of revolution is something that, as if there was a trend was inverted and started spinning the other way. It's really not like that by the slightest. Yet, this role of Constantinople as an altar capital fundamentally became such beyond the intention of Constantine, right? Constantine had conceived his city as a capital in the east. That's all it was, to which probably he wanted to tie his dynasty as well, and he probably didn't have, however, any intention to break with the past. Rome remained the symbolical center of the empire, right? This is often gotten as, Rome at a certain point was not the capital of the empire anymore. The Roman Empire had always, whichever Roman Empire we're talking about, Rome as its capital, right? And it was the only possible one for religious reasons, both for Christians and for pagans at this point, actually, because it was the same. Here we can't digress in the usual religious side of the story, but you understand that the very sacred places that had allowed Rome to rise, and the place of martyrdom of Peter and Paul, like this is Rome is the only possible and imaginable center of the world. Simply, there were other capitals, right? Trier, Milan, just to speak of the West, were already more important than Rome as specifically administrative and strategical centers. Naissus and Nicomedia, those were also, very important key points. Constantine creates this other reality because Byzantium was fundamentally was not even such an important center. It was this Traco-Hellenic city that, it was on this amazing geographical area, because usually, the Greeks founded their cities on this very well chosen places, but it had never been particularly important as a city historically. Not even in Hellenic, not even in Roman times. Constantine properly creates the whole thing. I mean, Byzantium was fundamentally just the Acropolis of the old city, where it's the top capital today, because the Ottomans swallowed also the entire imperial palace of the Byzantines. But that was it. Constantine created this enormous thing that eventually was provided with new walls, so it was re-expanded again. But it was something that was built properly from scratch at many levels. And here it would be interesting other notes to make. For example, the translation of the apostolic relics, right? Constantinople was eventually provided with a metropolitic seat, and it had, differently from Rome, from Alexandria in Egypt, from Antioch and Jerusalem, was not tied to any apostolic tradition. It had properly no charisma in itself. So he thought, well, to translate it and also to have himself buried in the center. So there are deep symbological informations you can draw, also even just from an architectonical, urbanistic point of view in Constantinople. You see a mix also between Christianity and paganism. Constantine built many pagan temples, he was absolutely fine in the way a 4th century Roman emperor could be towards these three. We will talk also about his properly ecclesiastical policy that changed fundamentally also in here the history of Christianity with and of the world with the Council of Nicaea. But the point is that this new center could be, at least at the beginning, like a center like others that had existed up to this point. I mean, the preference for different cities from Rome as seat of the imperial government was a normal fact in late antiquity, and already by this time the real capital was to be, I mean, the one that where the emperors actually ruled was found where the sovereign resided, right? And if the emperors were more than one, as we've seen, it often happened, each of them had their own government and their own also bureaucratic administrative apparatus, the comitatus, right? Also, it's basically their own army in the place that followed them constantly, right? So the difference that Constantinople made, though, is that her choice was not a purely transitory fact, and on the contrary, the new city was destined to rapidly grow in importance up to equate the old Rome. Also, thanks to a series of favorable causes. First of all, the very florid strategical position that allowed to surveil the routes of invasions in the Balkans and to block the access to the rich regions of Asia Minor. To this is to be added that it was a very important commercial center. It controlled the traffics between Europe and Asia and the maritime passage from the Black Sea to the Aegean Sea. So this all produced, or at least accelerated, this shifting towards the east of the center of gravity of the empire, a phenomenon that was already there from a while and ever increasing for reasons that are mostly connected also with, mostly for matters of monetary, probably the flux of money that these centers could offer. There were, historically speaking, more urbanized centers than the West, right? Yes, the West had places like Italy or southern Gaul and southern Spain. Africa also were deeply Romanized, some of the most Romanized provinces of the empire in the absolute terms, but the rest was a bit out there on their own, like all Atlantic Europe fundamentally lays there, right? It is very rich agriculturally, but at this point the contraction of late antiquity had brought to a broader impoverishment that in the East we don't find so marked, right? And this was naturally quite important. Also, Constantinople was eventually chosen habitually by the sovereigns as a residence, right? It was a tendency already very strong up to Theodosius I that became constant when, starting from Arcadius' successor, the emperors began to be sedentary proper. But throughout all the 4th century, in spite of the very rapid growth of the city, there was not the idea that this was like a substitute of Rome or even of other specific capitals as such. It's just that it was properly designed as a new one, in one that had unitly, they needed to have the characters of a specific capital of that dynasty. Here, the dynastization, together with the monarchization, naturally comes also the dynastization of the empire. The Roman Senate still had a very important weight, and it was also fundamentally conservative and opposed to many of the monarchic, broadly meant, politically, religiously, measures of Constantine. So he said, you know what, I'll create a center here so the Romans will not bother me. And these divisions remained, right, also in the differences that were speaking before, between the West and the East. There were very different realities. Since ever, we could say, this is not a matter of the fate of the halves of the empire. This is really that, the halves of the empires existed because of pre-existing characters that here we can't discuss, but are really connected to the pre-existing realities of that world, right? When people say, well, this began, for example, to be a more Hellenic-minded reality, it is objectively true, right? It is important to recognize that many of those features that are, labeled as Byzantine, or say connected to the eastern half of the empire, are in many ways the flowing of Hellenic culture, mindset, and in society, even at certain levels, in the new world, always maintaining naturally that here the Roman, even the Latin prevalence was quite important, especially in the state proper, right? In fact, when we talk about the so-called Byzantine Empire, we fundamentally stress the fact that Roman law, right, then Greek culture, Christian religion, but the centrality of the unity of the empire, of course, was what all these emperors sought to maintain, right? Nobody came up with the idea of, okay, let's split for fun this empire because, I don't want the other chunk, right? Because it's decadent. Nobody ever thought anything like that. They obviously wanted to control the whole thing, and naturally there were also specific areas of the empires we were saying before that will also be, for example, the same ones of the Justinian reconquest in the West, right? That were more, in touch with this new, that were more in line, more homogeneous to also to the eastern provinces, under specific traits, very different otherwise for others. So it was a formula, like late antiquity. We made videos specifically on late antiquity, trying to identify the characterizing features of this era. Then a century later, the new capital counted already 500,000 inhabitants. At the time of Theodosius II, it was necessary to widen, as we were saying before, remarkably the urban perimeter, building the new walls, the famous Theodosian walls that substituted the Constantinian ones. Right. Consider that Constantinople was literally the largest city of the empire at that point, because by some actor it surpassed Rome even in terms of surface, and so this really makes you understand what even just the interests and the pride. Constantine, for example, began to supply the city as it was done with Rome, right? It was a specific interest in concentrating resources in there, starting controlling the reality from there. And whoever chose this, broadly meant, and definitely Constantine had surely as an individual to deal with that, understood a lot about that word it meant, and they really got many things right about this all, because after all, I think that the Constantinian times realized, and way better than what we could ever do, also historically speaking, really the dynamic of that world, right? They really knew what worked, and the history of the Eastern, as you know, I don't like the term Eastern Roman Empire, because at some point, it wasn't anything. I mean, Eastern Western is a dichotomy that you use as long as there are two halves. So when the other one half is done, there's nothing like the Eastern Roman Empire. It's just Roman Empire. So just to differentiate the thing, I do use Byzantine, and this triggers many people. Apparently, there's always some. I get all likes on my videos, but every time I make a Byzantine history video, I get a dislike, because it is someone either hates the Byzantine history or doesn't like the fact how I dressed it. So I know that this causes malaise, but I made a like a 2 hours and a half video to explain specifically what we mean by Byzantine and why we can use it, even if it basically doesn't mean anything, right? It's just an historiographical convention, but it has a specific functional reason that simply saying, this thing didn't call itself in this way, it doesn't help to address the historical problem. Because if it was that in whichever language you speak, you should readjust all the national adjectives that you use to define the world. If you do it just with the Byzantine Empire, it's because evidently there is some bias of sort, right? And this is unfortunately what is being handed down even to the new generations. I have to point out always this thing, but actually it's not. There is not a great intellectual pride to derive from such statement. There are way more important things about Byzantine history that are worth mentioning, and just in case, the greatest experts in the world in the academies still call themselves Byzantinists, among the other things, and this has absolutely nothing to do with whether they think the term Byzantine is proper or not, which they perfectly realize it's not, but we call that like it for specific reasons that are historical, historiographical, didactical, that help way more than pretending that this is misleading or distracting, right? That just means being somewhat a fanatic, right? History Nazi in a way, and not even, just like a language Nazi, because there is no evil in using word. It just depends on what idea you attribute to them. If you think that in 2020 by Byzantine people just think the negative dark stereotype, it's because you haven't looked much around, especially from the latest historiographical achievements, but also more specifically towards the fact that objectively Byzantine history has been dramatically reevaluated even in popular culture. Like one of the few positive aspects, for a reason or another, spread through the masses it was received in a positive way, albeit generating this kind of fanatical, ideological, dogmatic approaches for which those become the new heroes for no valid reason, and then it's just fanboyism and stuff like that. But this has nothing to do with loving Byzantine history, right? And this is told by a person that at university, every time I could choose whether to have a Byzantine history exam in his curriculum, he got them there. So don't look at me as a sabotager. I don't know how to say that. So from an institutional point of view, Constantinople was not immediately assimilated to Rome either, right? This is also topic for an enormous video, because what all the intrinsic rivalry did exist, as we have just observed, also just for matters of senatorial and imperial policy. But the process was very long, right? Even the idea of creating a metropolis in there, and it was something very subtle that began at a point, and the other metropolitic seats didn't care about Constantinople. Said, what the hell are these guys, right? But since it was the new capital and the center of power was there, but people had to deal with the Constantinopolitan patriarch because it was protected by the emperor. At least, there were problems even between the two. But generally speaking, as you know, this is the feature of also of Eastern Christendom, is that the church was controlled by the empire differently from what will happen in the West for completely different reasons. So it's this is another path, and in spite of. So Rome was also recognized always the primacy at the political, even at the religious level, right? Primacy of charity, of charisma. But even here, Constantinople's growth was relatively rapid. Between the 4th and the 5th century, in fact, the city assumed the same characteristics of the old capital. Right, and just like Rome, she had a senate with similar functions, the same functions basically, a prefect, like the first civic magistrate, and it became a preeminent ecclesiastical seat. Constantine created in his city the first nucleus of the Senate. It was formed by representation of Roman senators that followed him in the new residence. So this filiation relation is also fascinating. As you were saying before, I made a video on the Constantinopolitan Senate. The idea is that this system was much more meritocratic in a way. It extracted the senators from mostly, of course, the protege of the emperor, but also from public administration that was structured in a more, in fact, it functioned in a more meritocratic way. It had a system of filtering the candidates that was also based on certain specific prearranged educations. It was not actually better than the one of the West, right? The ultra-cultural elite of the Roman Empire always remained in the Italic aristocracy by education, by sheer tradition, legacy, right? There is no comparison at all. In fact, the Roman senators felt always to be rightfully the true depositories of the Roman legacy. The Constantinopolitan Senate was a more functional and dynamic thing, right? Also more controlled by the emperor fundamentally, in ways that in Rome it would have not been possible up to a certain point. And it was a system that naturally allowed also certain recycling, let's say, of the various families, their appointment, for example, by the emperor, but also their demise, etc. So it was designed specifically to be functional to the imperial rule. And Constantine added next to this Roman elite newly made senators. The system, the newly founded system, let's say, was already functioning by the 40s of the 4th century. Under Constantius II, the Constantinopolitan Senate counted 300 members that rose up to 2,000 towards the end of the 4th century. The same sovereign in 351 instituted in the capital a city prefect, so at least from an administrative point of view, equating Constantinople to Rome, that enjoyed the privilege to be governed by one's own magistrate that was outside, let's say, the jurisdiction of the Praetorian prefects. So the assimilation to Rome for what concerns the ecclesiastical institution instead was slower because of the reasons were pointed out before. And it had its point of arrival actually in 451, which the Council of Chalcedon established the equality of the two episcopal seats. Basically, the Byzantines simply declared it on their own. This was never formally recognized. Let's say naturally the thing was, it was formally recognized at some levels, but it was just a matter of political negotiation, right? It was something extremely fluid. As you know, the popes already by this point were building their nets of ecclesiastical administration and management across all Western Europe. So these two worlds were already transforming into something different and separated at the same time. Yes, it began quite early. I mean, we can't naturally speak. I mean, by the 11th century, the papacy technically still felt to be within possibly the overlapping, let's say, both the Eastern and Western Empire, but already from this point, the popes had obtained a moral superiority, moral authority that was surpassing specifically what we can call the Byzantine imperial dimension, right? It was going on its own. In origin, the episcopate of Constantinople had been suffragan of Heraclea in Thrace, right? Because at the time of the foundation, there was already a Christian church, and it was under this other episcopate. But eventually, the episcopate of Constantinople acquired the rank of metropolitic seat, that is, the bishop of a major city of a administrative district, and therefore was counted together with Rome, Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Antioch as one of the most important ecclesiastical centers, commonly defined as patriarchates. I will spend some thought more about the Constantinopolitan Senate and the problems of the new aristocracy that we were discussing also. The Constantinopolitan Senate constituted this time the highest aristocracy of the eastern half of the empire, and together with the consistorium it formed also the state council of the sovereign. Right, we've seen this very important personal connection that the institutions in the East start having for the imperial authority specifically, and what was even possible to do in the West. Right, the West, even just think about the crisis of the 3rd century, Maximinian administration, the various wars against these different realities, right, of the militarized frontier and also the more civilian, let's say, Mediterranean reality. This dimension specifically had brought, as we said before, also characters as Constantine to search for a different, literally even geographical area to start building from its imperial power, right, and or its other personal power, more simply. And the Constantinopolitan Senate also carried out certain specific functions, such as it had the faculty of proposing laws, project, or the exercise of judiciary tasks, and the major importance of the assembly stood, however, at the institutional level in case of vacancy of the throne, because if the emperor in charge provided to appoint a successor, the Senate had basically to ratify that formally, specifically the election, right? The already happened election. But if the sovereign happened to die without having designed a heir, the Senate had the right to appoint him, and such a right was effectively exercised up to the 7th century, when the assembly basically lost any political importance, even though often it was more in appearance than a reality for the action of groups of powers that were capable of conditioning the designation. This is very important because it makes you understand that in spite of the gradual emptying of this, originally republican institutions in the East, the one of the most important problems of the previous of what had been the Principate, fundamentally, that arrives up to Diocletian, was exactly the successory one, right? The fact that properly the Roman Empire, one of the basically, I think, the only major fault of the Augustan system, otherwise something that lasted for a freaking long time, considering the previous, the absence of a previous balance and of and also the 300 years of which it lasted, and was exactly the lack of a specific successory system that could be institutionally functional, right? The thing of the Caesars and of the Augusti had already been there since a long time. If you look even in Flavian times, it was something concrete, right, in this broader tendency to the dynasticization. But even part of the great 3rd century crisis had been created by this, and it brought this response for which a more centralized power, and especially an organism like the Senate, was entrusted as essentially as either legitimizer of the happened election, or designing, being the institutionally recognized authority to recognize a heir had the emperor not appointed one before, was a response to this, was specifically aiming at putting an end to the vexata question of the succession that had been also the one that, as we've seen, had made the tetrarchy fail, right? So this naturally worked because of the centrality of Constantinople, because of the gradual extension of its control in this broader area. By the 7th century that we mentioned now, as you know, Constantinople is the true only large city, except perhaps Thessalonica in a way, that will live on, and that will gradually, and through even a privatistic system, begin to extend, to control, to infiltrate in the rest of the whole empire, so that by the 11th, it was just all a great private possession of either the imperial family or the other aristocratic family of the city. And this system did work internally, right? It had the capacity of replicating Constantinople's importance either through the sovereign, as now a steady resident in the city, or the local senate. This probably helped a lot, actually, even the survival of the Byzantine Empire at certain moments, right? This steady unity, even the Perpetua Sanctio would arrive, especially towards the end of the 4th century conceptually, this idea of sacralization of not just of the emperor but of the whole order of the imperial authority. It was specifically the one that was also connected to the emperor. This happened also in the West, partly, but never as much as in the East, right? The consistorium, the Sacrum Consistorium, was instead a narrower council composed by certain permanent members, that were the comites consistoriani, in fact, that were chosen within the ranks of the high bureaucracy. Now, this is quite important because it makes you realize that the aristocracy was basically kept at bay in the Senate with these offices there, naturally had to do with the government of the empire and so on. But there was a narrower and more important council that was specifically connected to this upper middle classes. Fundamentally, they were emerging still from the dynamic economical reality of the East that were naturally devoid of the power of the aristocracy, so they were more loyal to the imperial power that, as always, in monarchical sense, was way more allied with the lower strata of society than with the aristocracy that had always contrasted it in a way. So some comites consistoriani were such by right, others were directly appointed by the emperor. Even here there was a meritocratic criterion. And amongst the ones chosen by right, there were the highest civil and military officials, such as the Questor Sacri Palazzi, the responsible of the legal questions, the Magister Officiorum, that was deputed to the court service, the Comes Sacrarum Largitionum, and the Comes Rei Private, that were directing the financiary department, and also the Praetorian Prefect of the East, for the East. The military members had then to comprehend the commanders of the Imperial Guard, the Comes Domesticorum, and from the 5th century onwards, the Comes Excubitorum, plus the 2 Magistri Militum Presentales, from whom depended the mobile armies that were garrisoned in the capital. So the Praetorian Prefect, the Prefectus Urbi, or in Hellenic, the Eparchus, represented finally the Senate, of which he was the head in a way, and it was at the same time a functionary of state. And you realize in all this that even here all these functions are connected fundamentally to the city, to a bureaucracy, and or to the military that, albeit being dislocated in various the various frontiers, however, still depended directly from the imperial authority in the center. The eparchus would have gained growing importance up to the 10th century. It presided the judiciary life of Constantinople, it granted the public order, also provided to the supplying of the city, it was dramatically important, and also controlled its economical life. So the Byzantine aristocracy had since the beginning the prevalent character of functionaries nobility in a way. As we have seen here, they were fundamentally chosen for their loyalty, for their from an also lower social extraction, so that they wouldn't be compromised, right? And they would initially, they would also, by enriching, they could be inserted gradually in the rest of the aristocracy and maintaining certain connections with the emperor and trying to counterbalance the political spectrum. And this trend would maintain throughout all the whole Byzantine millennium as a consequence of the strong bureaucratic system that the Roman world at this point, especially since the end of the 3rd century, had acquired. And in Constantinople, there was never like a true hereditary nobility on the Western type, right? We've seen it before. The Italic Senate was constituted essentially by these families of very ancient origins that were such properly because of this also biological connection. In the East, there would be some, of course, clans that would emerge as some of the most important figures over time, but there was never properly this dynasticization of the aristocracy proper. The title holders of elevated public functions entered automatically to be part of an aristocratic class, the importance of whom varied in function of the office received. But the belonging to such a class and the relative title were not hereditary by themselves, and they specifically extinguished at the death. They expired at the death of the title holder. The civilian and military functionaries obtained fixed nobility titles in relation to the with the place covered in the hierarchy, both in the case they were functionaries in active service or at disposal, let's say, or whether they were, let's say, purely honorific offices. This, as you understand, favored that exchange that of individuals, of single families, for especially at the beginning of this period, and starting from a certain grade, in fact, certain level, every function was comprehended within a class of nobility, and of these classes in the 5th century were stabilized in growing order the clarissimi, the spectabiles, and the illustres. Right. At this point, everything is in Latin officially, right? In the state still, and these, those who were part of the latter, the illustrious, right, ones, were the highest dignitary of state. It was conferred to them by rule the title of comes, that was added as distinction from the designation of the major offices. And even higher, there was the patrician dignity, right, the title of patricius, or patricius, that was not connected to the exercise of any magistracy. Also, it was the most noble Palatus Caesar that were reserved instead to the components of the imperial family as well. And halfway between a simple dignity and an effective office entry was the consulship that survived as from the ancient, from the old Roman magistracy, and that kept being conferred to private citizens up to the 6th century, both in the East and in the West. And the consuls were distinguished in ordinary and honorary, and only the first ones entered actually in charge, while the others had this title mostly in a fictitious way. And to these were to be added also the imperial councils, because the sovereigns assumed in turn the office in one or the other side of the empire, and in this way they could become eventually colleagues of private citizens. The consul assumed his charge from January the 1st to depose it on December the 31st, and he preserved the old privilege to give his name to the year, as was also happening in the past in systems also in the chronologies and so on. And he, however, had the burdensome task to organize different spectacles for the people of the capital. All these titles were still responding to the older concept of monus, right? In a way, they confer this power, but also the duty of spending this money in a way. If you look even at the aristocratic of the urban elites, that's exactly also what the clarissimi and the spectabiles, the illustrious, were connected to sometimes, and in turn they had literally to manage the city on their own. So naturally they got their own benefit from it, but we're talking still about a moment, especially at this time, which resources weren't very available. The crisis of the cities also was an important thing. In the East, the formula for the control of the empire to the city naturally remained over time, and these officials had to face even this crisis, but they also ascended to this broader aristocracy that eventually could, even in the East, as would happen in the West, would create its own private power, and these were at the end of the day still landowners, but still a much more controlled, as we have seen, aristocratic class that in fact in the East will never quite reach the feudal levels, right, of the West over the centuries. And in part it is exactly to this pre-existing, pre-arranged properly preeminence of the central control on these aristocracies. The Byzantines also attributed a great importance to these ranks. Since late antiquity, they elaborated a complex system of precedences, let's say, that regulated in the minimal details the courtly etiquette. So, in their mystical political conception, in fact, the court of Constantinople was the place in which it was visually manifested, a sort of imperial religion tied to the extraordinarity that it was deemed to be connected with the figure of the sovereign wanted by God. This is what we were saying before. That's where the this is a very important characteristic of the Byzantine court and its ideal, right? This fixed, almost, this called also the very, very staged, very regulated court ritual, right? The Palatine ceremonies were considered the most tangible expression of such cult, right? They had therefore to be performed with order, regularity, to imitate the perfection of the universe, of which the terrestrial monarchy believed to be expression. This was a way to consolidate imperial power as well, because this, let's say, regulation naturally was extended to the rest of, as we've seen, the aristocracy as well. It was believed that this system would be inalterable, right? That nobody could fundamentally change it, together with all the regulation that the empire was that underwent in this period, from a juridical point of view, from a social point of view. So yes, there was really a strong control being extended. Like, it had not seen before, especially in these specific areas of also in the same Hellenic world in part. So the freedom of cult granted to the Christians was important in the process, because Constantine understood that the imperial authority could be fundamentally backed also by this further religious community that was at this point had a great spread, a great number, just in spite of the persecutions and so on. So Christianity was favored by this naturally, and it was affirmed with also a rapid integration with the political structures, especially of the Eastern Roman Empire, in which the Christian faith was strongly rooted. And the Edict of Tolerance of 313 naturally didn't make Christianity become a religion of state. Right, it would happen at the end of the 4th century. But it recognized, however, the freedom of expression that had been previously denied by the persecution. So the Christianization of the empire was, in a way, a sort of unnatural process at this point, considering the enormous capacity of penetration of the new creed and the fact that all the following sovereigns in Constantinople were Christian, right? With the only exception, a single exception of Julian. Here we should open a parenthesis about Constantine's beliefs, but it's also one of those topics we were saying at the beginning. It's too vast to be. The only thing we can say is probably was both, right? He was both a pagan and a Christian. It was absolutely normal by any late antique standard and beyond. And naturally, he was pretty clever in this regard. There are different currents. There are people who say actually, that he didn't, there's all the thing that allegedly he had himself at times. But we're not even sure about this. There's all stories, historiographical, creations, or adaptations. Naturally, Constantine was depicted by the Christians in ways that made him the founder, let's say, of the Christian Empire. It's not properly from an imperial point of view. I mean, but the situation was not properly like that, and there is no certain evidence of the fact that Constantine was not that he was a Christian, but that he preferred either Christianity over paganism or vice versa. Right? They were coexisting. We're just instruments of government. Brilliant, cleverly played, but once again, here there is no dramatic fracture, right? There is just a green light to Christianity to spread uncontrolled, and that's pretty much it. And the following emperors understood, naturally, because of the importance now that the church had acquired, even just because of the Constantinopolitan seat and the polarizing effect that the city had, even in its surroundings. Think about Nicaea, 325. We will see in a while. Would have for the empire to control this enormous system of the church that was basically substituting itself to the state, where the state was failing as well. Right? Think about all the welfare state, in a way. It was all Christian. At least for those who were part of it, but more specifically, here we're talking about the cities. Christianity was, at this point, of enormous importance because of the city control. The dioceses were urban, and controlling the Christian communities meant very often to control the city. And therefore, all this broader connection that our cults didn't have as such, right? They were not as organized as the Christian church at this point. They were just mostly, local, right? Or even if there were think about Mithraism or other cults, well, these were just mostly practices sometimes they were elitary in part. They had also kind of more extremistic messages in a way, more exoteric, mysteric nature than even what the Christian one objectively had, right? Because the Christians had this duality of the public, properly the administration of the church, that other cults didn't properly have, right? Together with the mysteric side of it. But the affirmation of Christianity naturally didn't go let's say, simply so smoothly. This procured caused also important contrasts with the pagan element, that naturally from persecutor became persecuted over time, even in those conditions in which fundamentally the emperors that were the emperors did at a certain point didn't even care. I mean, they just wanted, for example, the cities to stay calm, right? And so to maintain trade contacts, right? Not to rebel. Same goes for the surrounding countryside. It was the base of the city, but fundamentally they didn't care very much whether it was either the Christians or the pagan to prevail at some point, especially in the early times. Just preferred to maintain the order. So if this was enforced with violence, but one of the two sides, this was fine, as long as naturally the church didn't become to press too much in all of the other cities, and that's why this was the favored element at the end of the day, because there was this gluing factor that, after all, existed between these various communities. There were surely also clashing among each other. Think about the Arian heresy and so on, that brings in fact to the Council of Nicaea. But that's what helped. That's where we see the imperial intervention to define better an orthodoxy, for example, a standard, right? Properly a steady order even within the ecclesiastical matters. And the heretical contrasts within the church also were very widespread, and this is what also where we see the ambiguity for which many Roman emperors were Arians at a time. It was the same Arianism that could even prevail at a point. And the councils became this very important centers to define the dogmatic lines, were mostly held in the East, right? Because in the East basically existed most of the metropolitic seats that were the most important cities of the empire. So even in here, the proximity of Constantinople to them helped, and all this thing was very confused at the beginning, right? Nobody could properly tell whether at this point Christianity would have taken over completely, or whether it would have been the Arians of this or Orthodoxy, and so on. Constantine just limited himself to eliminate certain cultural aspects that offended moral Christianity in certain cases. He had overthrown the temple of Asclepius of Aliga in Cilicia, that was famous for its miraculous healings. The one of Aphrodite in Phoenicia, where also sacred prostitution was practiced. As you understand, these were kind of extreme cases in a way, also important centers always in the East. And with Rome, Constantine, for example, had a completely different attitude. Of course, he basically didn't interfere more than much with the pagan centers of the city, with the senatorial aristocracy largely pagan. But we know also that to Constantine we attribute properly the foundation of the Archbasilica of St. John Lateran, properly the concession to the Christians. At the time it was outside the city walls, and that is, I hope you know it, the single most important church of the whole Christendom. And from the donation of Constantine, some of the most important ecclesiastical ideologies would be developed. There would be even here too much to tell, but it was probably a way to ensure different poles, different points of reference, right, in these realities that could make him maintain a control of very important and earthly areas of the empire. Constantine also prohibited certain pagan manifestations, such as the Aruspicine, also at a private level, that took form of an important limitation. Also magic, right? But this was already present in pagan times, actually, and he ordered the removal of the votes from the temple, and he promulgated laws in favor of the Christians, and he endly abolished the gladiatorial games. All these measures are also part of a broader form of, let's say, pacification, right? It had evidently a conflictual measure. It was a way of making a point there and posing themselves in contrast with certain realities. But at the same time, these were all events that also were all aspects that, by being regulated in this way, could offer a greater stability in certain realities, or at least even to extend the control on certain levels of private life. As you know, this had begun pretty early, right? It was, even in a way, it was one of the motives of the anti-Christian persecutions, that the idea that you couldn't fundamentally I can't help to say that we should digress every time in this, because it's not that the Christians actually invented persecutions. They just did it in a different way. But the pagan world didn't admit something like freedom of conscience, for example. There was freedom of cult at certain levels, but if you were imposed to you were fundamentally imposed to sacrifice to the imperial deity, otherwise you were out, right? And of course, the Roman authorities were also, moderate on this. Even the anti-Christian persecutions weren't the terrible baths of blood. They weren't generalized. Basically, every provincial ruler did whatever the hell they wanted, and after all, there were a few. The Christian persecutions were even more violent and more culturally targeting, right? They properly had this realization that everything was idolatric, had, for example, to be destroyed. How many statues you see, even just with destroyed nose and a cross place on the forehead, right? That's all the remnants of actually dark times, because Christianity, as you know, I made a lot of videos on the history of Christianity, and I attributed a positive value to the broader essence of its theology, its philosophy, or whatever you want to see it in perspective from, remains objective. But there's no doubt that being a Christian or being a pagan is absolutely no discriminant for this kind of violence. Both Christians and pagans were overwhelmingly just a mass of extremely violent, disgusting beasts, right? Like most people were at the time. And they did it naturally for a reason that it's difficult for us to understand, but that had a logic in that world, and that was played very cleverly by the authorities in this period to increase power and to perfectly obtain. So that there is no bad guy or they are all bad guys, right? So let's say in this way, right? There's not a better way. The pagans carried out horrible things as much as the Christians did, and the problem was the institutionalization of certain aspects that objectively Christian religion tended, to civilize in a way. I mean, think about gladiatorial games or other. Of course, other things remain slavery. But the world was changing. The Christian morals were spreading also this broader idea of pacification, which is important objectively for an empire of that magnitude, and for those problems we have seen with that video of Ambrose of Milan, the creation of properly a Roman Christian consciousness at imperial level, the support of the Christians to the emperor, to the army, the acceptance of the use of violence for the defense of the empire. These were actually very sophisticated. They began to be very sophisticated problems that paganism had fundamentally not addressed. I mean, the concept, for example, of equality, the idea of especially of of freedom of consciousness was something that related at a double level with politics and society and the individual in ways that had never existed before. So that is a very delicate topic. We can't talk about it now, but we've already done it at some point. So if you really want to find a discriminant between paganism and Christianity, well, that is kind of the thing. Because if you look at it in terms of violences, regularly practiced at all levels in this societies, well, these were no better, no worse than others, right? It's just that this world objectively was more civilized, first of all, than many others. Secondly, it's exactly because of this that certain types of paganism and certain religions, certain theisms, properly as Christianity, could spread and did spread and take root. And it's not about one of the two systems being inherently different from one another, because all Christianity, for example, developed on the base of classical education, just saying something. Many pagans simply converted to Christianity for convenience, but also because they actually saw a point in there, and they were convinced by certain aspects, certain of Christian sensitivity, and certain problems that were taking place at the time. But generally speaking, it's the broader transformation of society that brings to these changes, not much the other way around. Or even if you want to consider it as an equal factor, just always consider that it cannot go without other important transformations that were already occurring on their own, including the same transformation of paganism into something which much more theistic. Do you think that what was believed at the time of Constantine among pagans was something that, I don't know, Caesar would have condoned, or Scipio would have condoned? It was a completely different world. Julian, even as a champion of paganism, he basically venerated, an Hellenistic, atheistic religion, right? Had, I don't know, Augustus seen that, it would have, much worse than, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, seeing him complaining and crying out loud in the corridors of his abode. We're talking of very complex realities and not of an ever-changing, right? So any dichotomic, drastic, and categorical cliche about saying, it's the pagans who did that, or the Christians did that, it's not historical, right? It doesn't have any historical thickness in it. But it's important to address anyway, because many people, I realize this because from a certain point onwards, I care for giving properly an answer, a definitive answer on certain issues, like in terms of perspective. That is, why would you prefer one thing over the other? Well, because there is an exact discriminant. If you start making relativism, saying everything was the same, we just now think like that because, I don't know, Christian triumphed, so even if you're not Christian, you may think otherwise because you're influenced by it. It's not properly true, right? There is a path even of improvement on the history of thought in this process. And we never made specifically history of philosophy on this channel, but we discussed how, in this case, these changes were all the reflection of a society. So it's not religion that as a single element makes the difference by itself, as if you could isolate it and say this is the thing that moved everything. No, even if the world at the time was exclusively religious, right, there was no one that fundamentally was not religious, right? It was unconceivable, but for practical reasons, not because atheists were or non-pagans. I don't know even how to say that, because it doesn't make sense. People believed in magic, they believed in spirits, they believed in supernatural on a regular basis. They didn't know modern physics. They normally explained the world through certain mindsets that we don't have today. So it's useless to pretend to rationalize this history by saying, okay, well, it's because of the evil either pagan or Christian that did this or that. No, it's realizing what improvement, what synchrosis what work of selection and destruction, because this happened as well, but also why it happened, on which base, and why was that society motivated to do it, right? The Christians were not just the fanatic horde that took over, right? Christianity was spread at all levels of society, especially from this time onwards, right? So it was the one of the masses, right? The masses are fanatical, are kind of ignorant, and that's why the Christians were discriminated before at the beginning. But we know that Christianity was spreading among even the middle classes, right, and alone, and you realize at that point that even if there was something about it that was not extremistic, because the middle class is the most moderate by definition, and when you talk about the elite, you also see in there certain important moments that are very motives that are very practical, for the sake of government in itself. As we were saying before, coming back to Constantine, it's not specifically clear what was the real adhesion to Christianity by Constantine. That, among other things, seemingly was baptized only before dying, right? So the problem is secondary, however, in relation to the influence assumed by the new religion in the Roman state, right? It's not Constantine that made the difference in the broader picture, but he was clever, dramatically clever, to ride the wave and to use Christianity as a gluing factor and as a support and as a even just as an ideological base to reinforce certain political prerogatives of its monarchy. So the novelty represented by Christianity in public life was evident already since the first ecumenical council that was held in Nicaea in 325, was summoned by the emperor to resolve famously matters of faith. Constantine took active part in it, right, directing his works and influencing its outcome, which shows the dramatically political character of this council as well. It was really a problem, right? As we were saying before, that the Christians were fighting against each other, so the thing could not go on like that. And also, he was acquiring the face of the Christians, the role of head of the Christian church, basically underlying the central role that the church itself had in the life of his empire. Because other elites thought otherwise. The Council of Nicaea is obviously the first of the councils that laid the base to the orthodox, to the religious orthodoxy, we could say better. And it marks also the beginning of the connection between state and church. That is typical of the Byzantine world, but generally speaking is at the base also of our current Western civilization. In the West, as we were saying, things happen in a different way. The Eastern specific here is that the emperor was specifically the head of the state, of the church, right? They weren't on a kind of equal level. Of course, the church thought of itself to be another thing, right? The church is not a territorial thing. In spite it has its administration, its people, etc. The church it doesn't belong. It's an entity on its own. It has nothing earthly aside from the people that live, the mortals that are operating within it, right? The Holy Spirit is within the church, so it's something that cannot be framed any under earthly rule. But the hierarchy that is created at this point in the East, it admits that as far as the earthly matters, right, were concerned, of course, the supreme authority was the emperor, right? This had dramatic consequences also in the West. In the measure, naturally, the Westerners tried to emulate the older Roman system, also what was the balance in the Byzantine world. In reality, in a reality in which the papacy, as you know, will do something very, very different fundamentally in the future. But the the important aspect of this imperial participation in the ecumenic councils is that the sovereigns inserted themselves interfered regularly in the theological disputes, literally taking part even sometimes as theologians. I mean, we find emperors who were naturally also in the future in Byzantine history, they were very well Christianly educated, I mean, theologically educated, so they the Byzantine Empire, as you know, took this character of depending entirely on this theological dispute, so much that even the common people in the street were sent to investigate this aspect. Naturally, it was all political, right? It was all political, and religious matters was there, and its importance as well. But all of this, as religious as it was also political. At Nicaea it was condemned the theory of the Alexandrine priest Arius that denied the identity between the Son and the Father and the Son, famously, stating that Christ had been created by the Father. Now, the Arian doctrine was banished for this reason, and instead Nicaea affirmed the dogma of consubstantiality, that is, the perfect identity between Father and Son, even if sometime later Constantine himself actually changed his mind and imposed the readmission of Arius in the ecclesiastical community. Even here, fundamentally political move. We don't have to think that even a man like Constantine didn't actually believe in the supernatural of it, right? In the specific connection with the deity, because that's what Roman emperors and what this whole world had exclusively been doing since ever, because the whole history of mankind had been exclusively based on this, right? There was no other way of thinking differently. The relation at that point is, however, also ecclesiological, because it has to do with how do you want this church to become, and which faction do you want to, which asset you want. So it surely invested Constantine morally, but these are aspects also that we cannot know, right? The history of Christianity is full of examples of political powers that were just compromising or staying afloat or improving the situation with certain religious beliefs, and fundamentally they even believed the opposite personally, right, intimately, but they simply had to do something else, right? This is mostly the pattern through which all these issues should be studied, because otherwise, if you believe that the problem was whether he was undecided between the two things only, and that's only a problem of conscience, Constantine exterminated basically his own family, so you cannot judge with contemporary moral standards, thinking, the Constantine was wondering what's better, it was all one with the political and social reality, and it naturally responded to very earthly policies and needs rather than just spiritual, that however informed also naturally the earthly aspect. So the let's say Arianism remained banished, albeit it it maintained fundamentally a large consensus, and eventually came to assume even an official role when they got basically the support of the Emperor Constantius II, that in 359 attempted newly to impose it. And declaredly Arian was also Valens, right? But after his death in 378, famously, the empire came back to the Nicene orthodoxy that was reconfirmed. The Second Ecumenic Council took place in Constantinople 381, so this speaks for the importance of the center also for religious matters. And Arianism became the predominant religion also among the Federati Goths, mostly for the East. They were converted to Christianity under Constantius II by work of the Gothic bishop Ulfila, that led an intense activity of apostolate among these people, translating, by the way, the Bible in Gothic and inventing for the occasion also a proper alphabet. And as a consequence, when in the following centuries the barbarians began to swarm into the Roman Empire, even if they were converted to Christianity, they presented themselves mostly as Arians, but they were pagans fundamentally, but at least they are elites for searching the support of the Christian authorities. The imperial authorities that were Christian declared themselves Arian. And this also created an important contrast with the local element of the empire that had very important consequences also for the, especially in the east, I would say missed opportunity to integrate the two systems. This also would require a bit more of attention, because it's not mostly a religious problem even in here. In the West, things got relatively better, not just because the Germans took the upper hand eventually, but it eventually got Catholic anyway, but because Constantinople objectively had this wave of anti-Germanic feeling for a while, right, especially at the beginning of the 5th century, that even led famously to the extermination of the gods of Gaius. This also happened in the West, partially with Ravenna, but if you look at the history of the Western Roman Empire, the results were very different. Since they were already since the beginning, because after all, the West was somewhat more receptive than the East in this regard. It has a bit of pre-existing xenophobia for reasons that here belong to a too long issue to discuss, but it's about the different relation that the Greeks had with the rest of the world, that, for example, the Latins, the West, broadly speaking, didn't have. But this is another, or had that, however, in different measure. This is another topic. So today we actually didn't even talk much about Constantine himself, but we have, I think, addressed certain aspects that can help to frame just the period, because a video like this cannot be done, in my opinion, because it's about the Constantinian era, but it's too much. Look at how much is published about Constantinian times. It's all probably interpretation. We should look at the very details of all the various historiographical works, and even in there keeping to wonder what this was really about. And yeah, that's what at some point we could even try to do, but it's naturally it naturally takes time. However, I think we can stop it here. We will make other videos, okay, as usual on these topics. But for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.